Let me introduce Doug McWilliams. Doug is one of Europe's foremost economic forecasters. He's been called today's equivalent of John Maynard Keynes or Adam Smith. He's got a book, The Flat White Economy, which has been reviewed as one of the best books on the British economy in the past 50 years. And he's going to be telling us what we can expect and how it's going to affect sports betting. Now, he's going to have a presentation. There'll be time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have a question, let us know, and we're going to get to you. This is Doug Williams, guys.
Well, thank you very much. I think someone must have lifted some of my own propaganda from the description of me. Best economist since Maynard Keynes, yes. It's a good marketing trick, isn't it? But perhaps just a little bit of hype? I don't know. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's unusual to go to a conference where economics is a light relief, but I think it probably is here. So I'm the guy who takes you in through a soft subject, which is economics, before you get into the hard subjects like gambling and so on, which are much more serious than economics in many ways. If you want a copy of my presentation, please ask the Matchbook people. I've given them full permission to circulate. The only thing I ask is that you don't try and sell my forecasts and go into competition with me. And the reason I ask you not to do that is that we change our forecasts very frequently, and you don't want to be selling last month's forecast. It will be out of date. But otherwise, you're welcome to use it, particularly within your own organization, if you think they're worth repeating. What I'm going to try and do is show how the huge amount of economic change affects the decisions we have to make. We're going through a period where change is unprecedented, and it's affecting everything we do. And it's happening in all sorts of fields. It's not just technology, it's not just lifestyle, politics, etc. Everything is changing at a dramatic pace. If you don't keep up with it, you can get wiped out remarkably quickly. And it's a sobering thought that only 5 of the original FTSE companies are there now, and the FTSE was set up only 40 years ago. So it's quite something to think that 95 of the companies have changed, morphed, or disappeared. And it just shows how much things, and if you tried to do the same analysis 100 years ago, you'd find that roughly the same companies would be in charge 50 years on. Not now. There's a huge pace of development and change. What does it mean for us? And to some extent, the gambling industry is so far ahead of the rest of the economy that it's driving the change rather than being driven by the change. But I'd like to try and show a few areas where it might want to keep looking ahead to try and ensure that it stays successful. And it is one of our more successful industries. I'll start with the global uncertainties and where the global economy is going. I'll say a little bit about Ireland and about the UK as well. Then I'll come on to the super trends, which I think really are making a huge difference. Then gambling, derivatives, and insurance. If you think about it, they're all the same industry. And maybe someone really clever will find a way of matching or persuading people to gamble on things that people have insurance for and matching it up. I think that would be the ideal way of reducing the costs involved in the industries by laying off the bet in that way. Finally, what can we do to make ourselves more successful and to make sure the system works better? Because we're all sitting on a branch that some people are trying to solve. And unless we get our act together, there are plenty of people with really silly ideas about how to change things. And unless the guys who've got good ideas get their act together, the guys with the silly ideas might win. So we've all got a role to play in that, and we all need to see ourselves as ambassadors for the system that makes us that keeps us alive and helps us stay in business. Right, this is the global economy. And the best thing to look at for the global economy is there are things called FTKs, freight ton kilometers. 30% of all trade in goods now, by value, goes by air freight. It's a staggering change. Pretty well all pharmaceuticals, most electronic goods. The things that tend to go still by boat are big, heavy items, commodities, raw materials, that kind of thing. But for the rest, air freight is now driving world trade. And the staggering thing, and it's the best indicator of world trade that you can get, the data is accurate because aircraft movements are monitored, except possibly for a few in the Caribbean, dropping off things, substances in kilos. But otherwise, aircraft movements are monitored. Everything is registered quite carefully. And so the data is accurate, number one. Number two, it tends to be about the leading industries. It's the pharmaceuticals, it's the electronics, and so on. And number three, the data is very timely. It is made available, I think it's just 3 weeks after the end of the period to which it relates. Other data on world trade tends to be 4 or 5 months out of date. So it's not so useful. And there is one staggering fact for this year, which is that freight ton kilometers have grown as much this year as in all of the 5 previous years put together, which means that we're in a real world economic boom. It may not look like that from Brexit Britain, and Ireland, of course, is still to some extent affected by the property crisis, although the economy as a whole has largely recovered. But if you look around the world, and particularly in the Far East, it's boom, boom, boom. I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. That means we're in a very different world economic situation from where we were a year ago. And one of the things is even managed to get Europe, which has been flat as a pancake, has managed to get the European economy to start growing again. Even places like Greece and Italy are now looking as if they'll see something close to 2% growth this year. Italy, up until the end of last year, had actually had no economic growth in the entire century so far. So 2% growth may not seem a lot, but it's quite impressive. The United States has got slightly volatile politics, but the economics sort of moves ahead. It's driven by technology, and the United States is still the best at driving technology, partly because most of the modern technologies require huge economies of scale. And the United States really was the first country to develop mass marketing. It's a huge country. The population density of the United States is 3 times less than the population density in Europe. You have to communicate with lots of people spread over a huge area in the United States. They developed mass marketing. And in industries with huge economies of scale, mass marketing is the thing that really drives it. And so that's essentially why the Amazons, the Googles, and so on have all come out of the United States. We're seeing a bit of a challenge from China, but it tends to be only in areas where they've been given a leg up by their government through restrictions on other companies. Otherwise, the American companies tend to be leading in the technology field and have done very well so far. I think eventually they're going to have to be regulated or split up, and that will be a serious issue, but it's not there yet. It will come along with us. So the United States economy growing even in the hurricane-hit third quarter by 3.6%. Looks as if it's keeping on going, and actually is going to have, on our forecasts, 12 years of expansion. Not very rapid expansion, but arguably not very rapid expansion, but sustainable expansion is better than boom and bust. Eurozone has come up off the floor. Now, because of the euro and the way the euro works, effectively you've got a currency without a government. If you've got a currency without a government, you have to have very heavy restrictions on what governments can do for both monetary policy and fiscal policy. And what that means is that the sort of fiscal expansion that the Chinese are doing, that the Americans are doing, is not actually technically feasible in Europe. Europe's most successful economy is Germany, and Germany, far from stimulating its economy, is actually running a big budget surplus. So to get Europe up off the floor, you need to have a booming world economy. Unfortunately, this year, we have got a booming world economy, and that's lifted Europe up, and particularly the Eurozone, which had been dragged down behind by the problems of trying to run a currency without a government. I said I'd mention Ireland. The first thing you look at when you see the graph of Ireland is the 2015 GDP growth, which was just over 25%. Now, normally, if you hit 4%, you think you're doing well. So 25% is pretty damn fantastic. However, it's one of these things where there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. In this case, the 25% growth came. Ireland is responsible for a third of all the aircraft leasing in the world. And 2 of the big 5 companies moved into Ireland in 2015. And so gave the statistical boost to Irish GDP. It's just a change of location by the companies, which meant they got included as Ireland, whereas previously they'd been included somewhere else. However, the more important thing about the Irish economy, which you can't really see on this graph because the scale is so distorted by the growth in 2015, is that it's growing at 4% at the moment, and even though we expect a slight slowing down, it looks likely to exceed 3% in the out years. Now, I was the first guy to call the Irish recovery after the property crisis, when I think the local economists in Ireland, having got it wrong previously, were a bit shy about saying that they thought the recovery would start. I went to an RTE and said that the Irish economy was definitely going to recover and called the year right. So I feel quite proud of that as a forecasting achievement. I think that the Irish economy is still one of the world's more successful economies. The consumption after the property bust fell in Ireland by more than it fell in Britain during World War II. That's an indication of the scale. When I went over to Dublin, not only were the restaurants empty, but even the pubs were empty. And it takes quite a lot to separate an Irishman from the pubs. I think I've never seen an economic recession so bad that pubs have been emptied before anywhere. And I wouldn't have expected that the first place I'd see it would be Ireland. And there it was. But the economy has recovered dramatically. I think there was a slight sense in Ireland that actually the boom was a bit false. I blame it on Catholicism. I was brought up as an Irish Catholic too. And I think when you're brought up as a Catholic, you always have a sense of guilt. And I think there was a slight sense of guilt about the upturn. There was a feeling that they were living slightly too high in the hog. And I think that's why the Irish took much more aggressive measures to deal with the crisis than some of the other European countries that had been in the same situation. As a result, the Greeks, who really haven't addressed their problems except when it's been imposed upon them from outside, their economy is still, it was going down in the second quarter. I think it will pick up in the second half of this year. But basically, the Greek economic crisis is still with us. The Irish economic crisis is history. Although if you're a property owner and still have a property value below that of the value of the mortgage you have on it, you may not think that. But from an economic point of view, it's done. The UK, I was quoted in the press on the day of the Brexit referendum saying that the UK economy was going to boom regardless of whether we voted to stay in Europe or voted to leave the EU. And that's roughly what happened in the initial months afterwards. We're now going through the second phase, where British growth has dropped below the European average, which is not surprising because there's been a big shortage of inward investment. as people have faced up to Brexit. That's what you'd expect in the circumstances, because there's a lot of uncertainty, and no one quite knows how it's going to turn out. And you'd be mad to make a heavy commitment at this stage, other than building on assets that are already there. I actually think Brexit will be a success. I voted for it, as did actually the leaders of the top 4 economic consultancies in the UK, who probably, I think we can probably say we've got a better forecasting track record than government organisations and journalists. The people who were against, the economists who were against, tended to be either working for the government or in the media or academics. And those people who actually provide the economic advice to the main companies were surprisingly pro-Brexit. Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist at the Bank of England, said economics is in crisis because he got his forecast wrong. What he ignored was the fact that the people that the businessmen get their advice from didn't get their forecast wrong. It was the Bank of England and the Treasury and various other people like that. But then, if they worked for the government, you wouldn't necessarily expect that they would be the first pressings of the grape. These are people in the public sector. So we don't necessarily think so highly of them. The UK will be a success one way or the other. I think the economy is basically pro-growth. It's got a very liberal labour market, and it's noticeable that the flat white economy, which now accounts for 10% of GDP, more than manufacturing, developed first in the UK. It's because of the flexibility of the economy, which came in the 80s and 90s, and it means the economy can adapt to different regimes and will adapt to whatever Brexit regime we end up with. So I don't think we should get too worried. It's just that the process of adaptation will be quite painful for people who have to change what they do. And obviously a lot of businessmen are going to be forced to change their plans and so on. And you can understand why they don't like it, but it doesn't mean they won't do it. Where we're getting real growth, other than Ireland in 2015, is in Asia. Malaysian exports are up 30%, Korean exports are up 30%, Taiwanese exports up 35%. And what you can see if you look at their exports is that China must be doing a hell of a lot better than the government statistics, because these countries couldn't have such export growth if China was only growing 6.8%, which is the figure released this week. They said they were growing 6.4% last year, and I think they were growing about 2% last year. My guess is they're growing about 10% this year. And they smooth the figures. In fact, they make them up. And it's unfortunate if you're trying to do economic analysis. What you just have to do is check for what's going on behind the figures and check those figures that they cannot massage. And they can't actually massage Malaysian exports because they don't have the power over Malaysia. So if you want to find out what's happening in China, it's best to look at other countries rather than just look at the Chinese statistics. The problem with the Chinese economy, though, is that it is built on excess savings. And if some people save too much, other people have to borrow too much. Now, there's no ultimate limit to the amount you can save. You can just keep on saving, ad infinitum. However, there are good prudential limits for the amount that you can borrow. And it's okay saying some people should save a lot, but if that creates a demand deficiency, someone else has to borrow too much, and then who's going to borrow? Well, we like to think that governments can get away with borrowing, but even they need to be quite careful about what they do. Certainly the private sector would be mad to try and offset the whole of the Chinese savings ratio by just going out and splurging, because we would all end up in debt and be unable to repay them. So that's the difficulty. And we've now used up most of the monetary ammunition. So my guess is that the next recession is going to be tougher than the previous ones, because with all the ammunition used up, with all the fiscal and monetary ammunition used up, there's much less scope to solve the problem next time things go wrong. And I think that will be sometime in the early 2020s. So watch out for that. The sort of nightmare scenario is we get a major world depression happening at the time of a lot of elections, and with politics made more sensitive by the growth in inequality that has been taking place in recent years. And if all that happens at the same time, you can get a perfect storm. And frankly, if Mr. Corbyn gets in, there's not much point making economic forecasts. What you really want to be doing is looking at which country to emigrate to. It's not... you want to work out how to get rid of your assets pretty damn quick, because it's not going to have a happy ending, I can assure you. One bit of good news for the world economy is that the energy crisis has not only gone, but actually we're going to have abundant cheap energy for the next 30 or 40 years. Prices will really start to fall in the next decade. Renewables have become cheap. I didn't think they would, and this is a forecast I got badly wrong. I thought renewables would always be an expensive luxury. It turns out that they're a cheap luxury, and that's the kind of luxury to have. 75% of the world's new power stations to be built between now and 2040 are going to be solar-based, according to BP, which is interesting, because BP, you can't say they've got a vested interest in that particular technology. And offshore wind, we had the latest auction in the UK a few weeks ago, and the price of offshore wind has halved in 2 years. The contracts for difference, which is what they auctioned for, had been running at £116, now down to 56. It's extraordinary to see the scale at which these things are moving fast. And I think cheap energy is going to be one of the themes of our next generation. Now, can we sustain ultra-loose monetary policy? Interest rates are clearly going to go up a bit. The governor of the Bank of England has basically talked himself into a rate rise when they next meet next week. But long term, you start trying to persuade people who are reluctant borrowers to borrow. Then you start to persuade people who don't borrow at all to try and borrow. That's what ultra-loose monetary policy is all about. Eventually, you're dealing with people who just don't want to borrow. And monetary policy stops working after a while. You can't keep on trying to find new people to persuade them to borrow more. When it reaches its last phase, what it does is it depends essentially on the impact of monetary policy on asset prices. So you're creating property bubbles, stock market bubbles, to try to keep people spending. That's a fairly inefficient way of trying to keep people spending, but it does work a bit. So that's basically what monetary policy is doing at the moment. It's sustaining property values and sustaining asset values. And I think all of these are likely to be spooked a bit as interest rates start going up. These are the figures. The Chinese, at one point, were saving 50% of their income. I mean, we save 10%. Saving 50% is a bit excessive. It partly comes because they got rich before they knew how to spend it. It also came because they have no social security, so you put a bit of money aside for a rainy day. And it also comes because jobs typically don't have pensions, so you have to do your own saving for your old age. And we, in the Western world, slightly hope that the state can look after us a bit. In China, they don't see that, so they've got to look after themselves, or make their children rich so their children can look after them in the style to which they hope to grow accustomed. So it's a different system, and that's why they save so much. It's coming down, but it's still high. And that's pushed up the world savings ratio, which is why we have such low interest rates. Now, the super trends are the bit that's quite interesting. we've had a growth in populism, and one of the causes of it has been a rise in inequality. My next book is called The Inequality Paradox, and it goes through why inequality is changing and why the income distribution is being stretched out. The first part of it is actually quite good news, because even though poor people in the West are finding capitalism doesn't work quite so well for them, much poorer people in the East are actually doing a lot better. And the inequality paradox is that while inequality in the West has grown, poverty, particularly in places like China and India, has dropped. Only 10% of the world's population now live in poverty in the sense of not having enough to eat. Whereas at the beginning of the last century, 90% of the world's population lived in those conditions. Getting that down is a result. And unfortunately, one of the sad byproducts of it is that the poorer people in the Western world are not doing so well. There are things you can do about it, and I'll talk about it a bit more later. You've also got the sort of wild politics with all sorts of interesting characters emerging on the scene. Some are more reputable than others, and some are perfectly reputable but just stupid. But stupidity seems to be no bar to getting elected these days. So, if you've got an attractive theme and people like your theme, they'll vote for you, even if your ideas are nonsense. And I'm afraid we've seen slightly too many of them. There's a loss of trust in the elite, who I think have been very, very arrogant in the way they've approached everyone. And I'm myself included, actually. We haven't explained why things like technology and globalization are good for people. We haven't explained to people why immigration is good for them. And partly it's that we're a little bit ashamed to say so. I mean, in Britain, the reason immigration really works in Britain is because a lot of Brits are quite lazy, and they need the spur of immigrants to keep them working. Now, that's a sort of politically rather incorrect thing to go and say to people, but we need pressure to keep us working hard, and that's what immigration does. That's why immigration boosts the economy so much. Globalization has meant that there's no hiding place. If you're doing a job in, say, manufacturing, you're competing against people who are prepared to do the same job and pay themselves between 1/10 and 1/4 of what you're paid. You have to be bloody clever to be able to sustain that kind of competition. It's a change. The odd thing was actually we got paid so much previously, not that eventually when other people develop the same skills, pay goes down a bit, but it's increased inequality, and of course people's expectations are conditioned by the past. And then immigration and trade are blamed for inequality and for people losing their jobs and things like that. Well, it's true, but you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So trying to think that you can do that is not all that clever. This is something called the elephant graph, and it explains what's been happening in the past from rising inequality. And it shows that the very rich have got richer, but also the poor have got richer. The people who've lost out have been the people who are in the richer half of the distribution, but they tend to be poor people in rich countries. And that shows on a worldwide basis what's actually been happening to income. Also, the very poorest, their position has actually got worse also. It's partly because a lot of their governments have failed. They live in failed states, and they're fighting each other or whatever. And war is not very good for overall total prosperity, particularly the sort of civil war you have in a place like Syria. I said I'd say something about Bitcoin. It's a scam. It is an utter scam. Now, just think about it. Any one of us could start issuing IOUs and hope that other people would accept it, so we wouldn't have to earn to fund our lifestyle. Our lifestyle would be supported by issuing, well, I would call them Doug coins, obviously. but you can give your own name to it. What it is a private individual has sold off, I've forgotten the precise sum, but I think it's in the billions, of dollars worth of stuff. And basically, he's given himself $1 billion by conning people into accepting them. Now, I've got good news for those of you who don't have them, which is that if they ever get too big, they'll be shut down. I was at the meeting of the central bankers around the world on Saturday, and it's quite clear that governments are not going to give up their monopoly of money lightly. They can put up with it while it's a small amount in practical terms, but they are looking at ways of making their own currencies crypto. And they're also trying to get rid of cash. Now, if you think about what most of us use cash for, a lot of these things are not entirely legal, like paying people and trying to avoid tax and so on. Governments hate that, and they are working very hard to get rid of cash. And they're working very hard to make currencies crypto. I think we may end up also with a single world currency, which will be based on a basket. We used to have special drawing rights issued by the IMF back in the 1980s, but they've gone out of fashion a bit. I think we'll probably see a global official cryptocurrency emerge, which will act as some kind of store of value. The Chinese want it because they want something that isn't dollar-based, and the Americans will be forced to accept it because they won't have enough political power to stop it. But I think we'll have something a bit different in the future. Right. Now, betting, insurance, and derivatives are all actually the same industry. So if you want to think of how to develop the industry, think how the gambling industry could take over insurance. No reason why you shouldn't. There is a difference of scale. Betting is a $500 billion industry, which looks big. But insurance is a $5 trillion industry, so it's 10 times bigger. Derivatives are a $1.2 quadrillion business. Now, if you haven't heard the word quadrillion, it's the one that comes after trillion. You go billion, trillion, quadrillion. So it's noticeably larger. And derivatives is the most sophisticated. Betting is the second most sophisticated. Insurance is still very out of date, really. And a lot of things are going to become uninsurable as we get more information. Quite a lot of insurability comes from being bad at forecasting. But we will get better at forecasting, for example, health and things like that. And that will make them uninsurable because there will be no one to take the other side of the bet. I think the insurance industry is probably the one that's going to have to transform itself most. Now, we made an estimate of how much gambling there is. We may be wrong. It's sometimes bits of it aren't measured terribly easily. But it's taxed very differently in different places. And it is still one of the industries which is one of the fastest growing industries in the world. It's a good industry to be in. What's quite interesting is that more than half the world's population live in countries where they don't allow online gambling. So I think there is a market opportunity. But I think to address this market opportunity, what you're going to have to do is deal with problem gambling. Now, most people know that I'm what they say, recovering addict. In my case, it was drugs. But when you've had an addiction problem, you realize how damaging these things can be. And I think you're going to see problem gambling becoming a huge social issue. And what I would say to you in the industry is you need to keep ahead of this. It's not technically your responsibility in a lot of cases, although I think some advertising sometimes goes a bit too far. But I think you will be blamed for it, even though you're not necessarily responsible. I think addicts are responsible for their own problems, not the people who supply them. However, the people who supply them will get the blame. And I think, as an industry,
if you want to continue and be successful, you should work really hard on this. Because if you don't get it right, then there will be a public reaction. And the good guys will suffer just as much as the bad guys. So I'd strongly advise you to try and keep ahead of the trend on this and take your own action. Now, how can we cope with a world where inequality is increasing? I think inequality is going to continue to increase because the two things that have driven it in the recent past have been, on the one hand, a certain amount of sort of crony capitalism and people ripping other people off. But much more it's been driven by globalization. However, over the next 20 to 40 years, I see the two biggest trends being, number one, inequality caused by technology, and number two, inequality caused by super babies. Now, you've probably heard about technology, but you may not have heard of super babies. Super babies come from, and it's difficult to say this in a politically correct way, but the problem, so to speak, is women going to universities. Most people meet their partners if they go to university, at university. It's the first time they're free from their parents and able to get up to whatever they want to get up to. And when women didn't go to university, which was largely the case up until about 1970 in Britain, it was a bit earlier in the United States, men didn't meet their partners typically at university, unless they were gay. And so it tended to be the stage after university, and quite often office-based, and a lot of men married their secretaries. Now what happens is 80% of graduates marry other graduates, and 20% don't just marry graduates from the same university, but marry graduates from the same course. Now, the problem is that you're getting a concentration of genetic inheritance mixed with high-quality parenting. I mean, you compare the chances of a kid, two parents, both went to a good university, both devoted to trying to bring that kid up, give him all the good nutrition, everything. And then think of some poor kid whose mother, and in these cases very often there's only one parent, working all hours at a job like cleaning or something, trying to make ends meet. And with 6 kids, probably with 6 different fathers. The kids of that marriage are going to have much worse chances because the quality of the parenting, inevitably, because of the time available, cannot be as good. And I'm not blaming people. I think actually bringing up a family of 6 on a cleaning job is pretty close to being miraculous. I think it's those people who manage to achieve it have done pretty well. But in the nature of things, there isn't the time available and there isn't the quality of attention available. So I think we're going to have to work much harder with super babies to try and do something to equalize the chances, to do what we can to equalize the chances of those who have fewer advantages from parenting. I think that's going to be an issue. We also got a lifestyle economy emerging, and as a lifestyle economy, people more want to do the things that they find give them a good lifestyle. Part of the problem with that is that you can't tax lifestyle. So whereas when everyone wanted to go and work in the city, that produced oodles of tax revenue. Now when people want to go and do a lifestyle job and live in the flat white economy, or there's been an increase in Britain from 160,000 to 420,000 of people whose occupation is given as artist or writer in just the last 10 years. There's a huge drive. Now, you don't get paid as much unless you happen to write a best-selling book. But if it's what you want to do, in many ways it's a good thing. But the government can't tax it. And I think governments are going to have to become much more focused on what they spend their money on And they're going to have to become much more efficient as well. The other thing is that part of the solution to inequality is sorting out competition policy, preventing monopolies, which is why I think we may have to break up the tech giants. Why we'll also, I think, need to look much harder at banking, which is still very heavily monopolized and needs to be broken up. Our task, if we're in business, is to anticipate these changes and try and defend them and try and adapt what we do so that we can keep up with the changes. They're huge. They're absolutely huge. So just to pull all this together, we're in a period of very rapid world growth. We're in a period of unprecedented change. The growth may be unsustainable if China goes belly up. China is by far the biggest risk to the world economy. The super trends are going to be hugely disruptive, and they're going to affect some industries more than others. What I slightly fear is the sort of perfect storm where we go into recession just at the time when political tensions are already enlivened by the consequences of inequality. And the bad guys, effectively, the guys who don't actually have a solution for our problems, their only real offering is that what they're offering hasn't been tried. And so they can't say it's failed yet, at least in this country. It's failed in Venezuela, it failed in Russia, and so on, but it hasn't yet failed in the West. And the bad guys could get in. And then, as I say, our main task will be deciding which country to emigrate to. There is no simple way of living with socialism. If you go to Venezuela, if you're in Russia years ago, emigration was really the only sensible option. So these are the sorts of things we have to deal with. Gambling is still going to be good as an industry, and there are plenty of opportunities. But let me repeat my message about problem gambling, which is, I think, that is probably the single biggest issue that your industry has to face. And you have to think how you can solve it and how the industry can own the problem and try and solve it before something stupid gets imposed on you. So good luck. You're in the right business, and I hope you will be successful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.